I was sharing an office with a guy I didn't know by the name of Charlie Knapp. He was also an experimentalist. Walked in, shook hands, and he immediately handed me the just recently published Scientific American article by Fromm and Harlow titled Computer Experiments in Fluid Dynamics. Knapp just said to me, "This is the wave of the future," you know, which I thought was amazing insight. And I still consider that article by Fromm and Harlow to be the real beginning of what we would now call modern computational fluid dynamics.
Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Patrick Roache. Dr. Roache wrote the original 1972 CFD book, Fundamentals of Computational Fluid Dynamics, and the original verification and validation book in computational science and engineering. He was the inaugural PhD of the University of Notre Dame's Aerospace Engineering program, and he's the developer of the Grid Convergence Index and made significant contributions to multi-grid methods and solution-adaptive grid generation. His career has been heavily involved in verification and validation. Dr. Roache has received numerous awards, including the ASME 2016 Fluids Engineering Award. He's become a dear friend and was so willing to share his knowledge and experience with us on the podcast. This interview was brought to you in collaboration with Dr. Aki Runshall and Analytic and Computational Research Incorporated. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss an episode. Patrick, it is such an honor to have you join the show, and I'm really excited for our discussion today, so welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Kate, and thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it also.
Yeah. So you've had an indelible imprint on CFD, and especially as we know it today, from cementing the term itself, CFD, with the publication of your 1972 textbook. But I'd like to start by asking you about your entrance into CFD. And can you tell us how you got started and how you were exposed to it in those early days?
Sure, be glad to. First thing, though, I'd like to beg everyone's indulgence. I'm 85 years old now, so if I slip, lose track of my trend of thought, I hope you bear with me. Well, to start off with, I got a bachelor's degree in 1960 at the University of Notre Dame, and I stayed on. That was in aeronautical engineering, by the way. There was no such thing as aerospace in those days. Uh, so then I stayed on for a 2-year master's program. And Notre Dame's aero department was very interesting in those days. The head of the department, F&M Brown, was a really very brilliant experimentalist. And he was very skilled in flow visualization, had unique, very high quality stuff. And yet he was eccentric and almost amateurish. He published very little. He did very good work, and specialists in the flow visualization knew he did very good work, but he just didn't publish much. But then one of his other faculty members, Vince Goddard, in Brown, worked on developing a supersonic smoke tunnel, which deserves applause and a mention. Most people at that time, and I would think even now, would think it's impossible to get any kind of quality with a supersonic wind tunnel. But in fact, there was a small research tunnel, Mach 1.4, and we were able to do single shot camera that included Schlieren or shadowgraph resolution of shocks and that sort of thing, and at the same time the streamlines. So it was really interesting, and I used it for my master's degree on experimental work on shockwave boundary layer interaction. And I emphasize the experimental work because I think that was a big difference between my approach to our subject today than a lot of people who were coming from the theoretical side. So I got the master's degree, and Then I taught for 3 years, and in the meantime, Sputnik had gone up, in 1957, and there was a lot of money uh, floating around from the government. So Notre Dame really upgraded the program and hired a new department head, John Nicolaides from NASA, who was a very dynamic guy, and he inaugurated a PhD program in aerospace. Um, in fact, I was the first guy to get a PhD from Notre Dame in aerospace engineering. Um, so what happened? I came back from North Dakota where I'd been teaching, and introduced myself to everybody, and walked in my uh, office. I was sharing an office with a guy I didn't know by the name of Charlie Knapp. He was also an experimentalist. Walked in, shook hands, and he immediately handed me the just recently published Scientific American article by Fromm and Harlow, titled Computer Experiments in Fluid Dynamics. And Knapp just said to me, he said, "This is the wave of the future," which I thought was amazing insight. And I still consider that article by Fromm and Harlow to be the real beginning of what we would now call modern computational fluid dynamics. Uh, and it was the first one to really make a distinction between that approach and of course there'd been a lot of numerical work done in fluid dynamics, boundary layer calculations, method characteristics, that sort of stuff. But this was a really, really different philosophy.
So looking back now, how did that paper change your perspective, right? It came at a very formative time. And how did it
Yes.
shape your perspective moving forward?
Well, it just changed everything. Uh, and it was a genuine paradigm shift, in the sense of Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science. Uh,
Yeah.
People, to do any kind of calculation or prediction in fluid dynamics or anything else, people would have to break down a physical model, like a boundary layer. If you start off knowing it's a boundary layer, there's no substantial pressure difference through the normal to the boundary layer. So you throw out terms from the Navier-Stokes equations, and in fact end up with a parabolic system in that case. And so you have this model in mind, and really you're simplifying the problem, simplifying from the Navier-Stokes equations and just the physical domain that you're looking at. This approach of Fromm and Harlow was just totally different. You just put in the Navier-Stokes equations into the computer code and the geometry, and of course the boundary conditions, which make all the difference in the world, and you turn it on and you see what happens. You don't have any, well, you have some preconditioned ideas of what's going on just because you know the physics of the problem, but you don't decide what region you're going to model in a certain way. You just turn it on and see what happens. And like for a backstep problem, if your Reynolds number is low, it's just a very steady flow. And if it's high, you get vortex shedding. And it just happens from the Navier-Stokes equations. Uh, it's hard to believe now with the popularization of flow visualization from CFD simulations, but experts in fluid dynamics, were very skeptical that this thing would work. And I remember people asking, how did you get that vortex to start shedding? And people say didn't do anything. Actually, if you use a very particular and inefficient numerical approach, you wouldn't even have asymmetry and round-off error, and you might not get vortex shedding. But in a normal approach, if you have even just round-off errors asymmetrically, it was enough to trigger the natural fluid dynamic instabilities, and it would start shedding. Or if the Reynolds number was too low, it wouldn't shed, and it was just amazing. Uh, and in fact, I still I'm surprised that it works in a sense. Uh, it's like uh, it's like people didn't really believe the Navier-Stokes equations. Yeah. And by the way, the same kind of revolution was going on at that time in other fields of physics. I think the next Scientific American article after Fromm and Harlow was on numerical chemistry, and it was the same sort of a very revolutionary paradigm shift. As for my career, the first summer back to Notre Dame, I worked on experiments with the same fellow, Charlie Knapp, who had a very big influence in my life, and we became lifelong friends. He had already started continuing work of F.N.M. Brown, the old department head, on boundary layer transition. And he had developed a technique of combined hot wire anemometer signals with smoke flow. Again, a lot of people thought you just couldn't do that the smoke particles would mess up this, two 10,000ths of an inch hot wire in there. But in fact, that was a little alcohol baths. He would keep that hot wire anemometer clean. And it was really pretty remarkable stuff to have this hot wire signal and the flow visualization of boundary layer transition coming out the same thing. And we got a nice journal paper in the AIAA journal on that, Knapp and Roache, which actually was, it's still occasionally referenced, but for several decades after, it was a pretty well-known article. So that was a lot of fun. And of course, the visualization aspect, I think, is a close connection to CFD, right? Because a lot of the fun and attraction of CFD calculations are the visualization aspect. Well, I did a lot of other work that summer on numerical fluid dynamics, like the Chapman-Korst base pressure model. I enjoyed that work very much. And my PhD advisor, Tom Mueller, had studied under Korst at University of Illinois. And I was really quite happy going with the Chapman-Korst base pressure model. And it was very, very effective. But Mueller really urged me to go with the Navier-Stokes approach, the full Navier-Stokes. He was not expert in it at all, but he could see that was the wave of the future. My initial idea was to do backstep. I wanted to do separated flows because then everybody knew that you needed the full Navier-Stokes equation. It wasn't going to be some small perturbation of a classical boundary layer solution. So I wanted separated flows, backsteps, driven cavity, which is a classic problem at that time. And I wanted to do supersonic and subsonic flows. And I also wanted to do the experiments because I was an experimentalist after all. And unfortunately, my PhD board talked some sense to me and said, drop the experiments. And in fact, I did get supersonic flow calculations, but a very crude resolution and kind of raggedy in convergence. And when we, pardon me, and Mueller and I published in the AIAA journal, we left out, we just did the subsonic stuff. I must say though, for the time, my PhD dissertation was big and did a lot of variations that most people didn't do. Like, this is 1967, and people weren't being very rigorous about just testing for things like outflow boundary conditions. And I not only experimented
Mm.
with a lot and developed a lot of new approaches for outflow boundary conditions, but I also moved the position of the outflow boundary, like
Mm.
3 different distances downstream, measured, of course, in step heights, to show that it was insensitive and to let the vortices shed out the back end of the computation. And I remember I did 7 different, versions of a reasonable boundary condition at the sharp corner. And so it was pretty thorough. Uh, and, okay, as I wrote in my 1972 book, uh, people were starting to recognize that the CFD was, emerging as a separate discipline. Uh, Originally, people thought pardon me, of course, Fromm and Harlow used the term numerical experiments, but still they thought it was like theoretical work, and there was actually a problem with the journal publication because editors and the reviewers came from either experimental side or theoretical through singular perturbation. So they would give the review of the articles to people who really didn't have any experience, but they thought, well, they're theoreticians, and they just did not. They were smart guys, but they just did not understand what the issues were. In fact, I had
Mm.
reviewers just turn something down saying, drop all of this stuff. You don't have to explain any of the algorithms or anything, They just didn't understand it. So gradually
Mm.
people woke up to the fact that this whole thing was different.
Yeah, that's absolutely remarkable to hear firsthand of what it was like in those days, especially it just starting out, right?
Yeah,
And like you said, the realization of people not maybe fully trusting the Navier-Stokes equations, right? Like
exactly.
seeing if the vortex
Exactly.
shedding would really pick it up. So,
Yeah, I just
yeah, I
tell
think
people just shake their heads and, you must have done something in there, started with a little vortex or something.
yeah, you planted something in there, huh? Yeah,
Yeah,
thinking that.
right.
So, yeah, can you share what it was like the early days of the CFD community, right? Because I think it's easy for me to forget how things must have gotten done then, right? Um, Now it can feel quite competitive, right? There's just different time periods, right? Today we have access to almost all
Right.
the information we can get. Back then, if you wanted to pull an article, I'm sure it was a different process of not being able to go online,
Right.
but it can also feel quite irrational and competitive today in the environment. But what was it like back
Right.
then in the environment you were working in and starting out in?
Yeah, it certainly was different. Mainly, I would say it was just a lot of fun. The spirit in the community was really lively. Uh, if you got a solution to anything, any problem, uh, people really wanted to know about it. And if you didn't get a solution, they wanted to know what you tried, what failed. And of course, it was a very small community. Uh, I mean, for years, uh, if I go to a meeting, they have a specialist meeting in AIAA was my primary uh, professional organization at the time. I usually knew everybody at the meeting, or if I didn't know them, maybe I knew their advisors. If there was a young guy there,
Mhm.
I would know what's going on. And it was just a really nice communal feeling, and everybody was aware that we were really on to something. This was pioneering stuff, and and it didn't take too much imagination to see that things were going to be changing a lot. I must say, uh, with a little perspective of what solutions are now, or even late in my career when I was still doing this stuff. When you look back at the theoretical work that was done, there weren't many successes. People were just tweaking the little potential flow, that kind of stuff. That stuff is very non-practical, let's say. So
Mhm.
even the coarse grid kind of stuff that when Aki Runsel was on your podcast, he was talking about
Mhm.
their work, with the group in England. They were already doing stuff with a very crude computer. Uh, they were doing stuff that people could not touch theoretically. Yeah.
Mhm.
So so that whole thing, our generation was really about algorithm development,
Mhm.
and uh, and there came a point when it's really not of interest. I don't know. You would know if people really talk about algorithms at all in a CFD course anymore, but that's what we were doing. And I went to an AIAA meeting in Hawaii about 20 years ago, and talking to some younger guys, and I just sat down at their table at a banquet, and the guy looked at me, and he didn't recognize the name or anything, and he finally said, "So you're old enough?" He said, "You guys were doing algorithm development, right?" And I thought, yeah, that's all there was. And of course, that's not true anymore. And what it's like is that, you know, people did a lot of very hard work uh, programming in machine language to come up with that square root routine that we just take for granted, or a logarithm. A lot of work went into that, and that work gets forgotten. But that's the way it's supposed to be. The next generation is supposed to stand on your shoulders, just like you stood on the previous people's shoulders. But yeah, it was a lot of fun in those early days. Uh, the other aspect that I would like to emphasize, if you want to know what it was like in the old days, was how primitive the
Mhm.
sort of computing infrastructure was. And I know people will think, well, of course you had these slow serial computers. The worst thing was not the computer speed or capacity. It was more fundamental things like,
Mhm.
uh, well, IBM punch cards. That's a lousy way to communicate to a computer. My very good friend Harry Dwyer at UC Davis uh, in those days, he said that he thought the greatest advance in computational fluid dynamics was the invention of the on-screen editor, so that you could just sit down at a keyboard. So a big high-tech advantage I had, and this is 1965, was in the new Hesburgh Library at Notre Dame. We actually had a copy machine, a Xerox copy machine, and I mean it sounds funny, but I'm telling you, it was rare. Uh, Another point uh, that the UNIVAC 1107 computer we had, of course, is a toy by modern standards, but it was actually very powerful in those days. Someone had gifted that computer to the University of Notre Dame, and very high-ranking schools around the country really didn't have that kind of computing power. And the Notre Dame administration was smart enough to just give us free time on it. We didn't even have to have a charge number. Of course, you still had to carry your 2 pounds of IBM cards over, give them to the desk, pick them up the next morning, and find out you made a mistake typing and didn't get a run at all. So that was the primitive part. The most primitive part in terms of impact is the fact that we had no word processors. If you can imagine, that was true even when I got around to writing the book in 1972. There were no personal computers, there were no word processors, and handling some 1,250 references without a word processor takes a lot out of your youth. It was really, really tough. Uh, Another primitive thing that we had that was really very much state of the art was a pen and ink plotter, a good one, an electronic one that you could talk to with Fortran commands. And they had alphabet and they had numbers, so you could actually make legends on the software. But beyond that, you were limited to commands like uh, raise raise the pen off the paper. Raise the pen, move the pen to X1, Y1, drop the pen on the paper, move the pen to X2, Y2, and that's a long way
Wow.
from contour plot software, which we all had to do in our own in those days. For just a minute, I'd like to go back when I was talking about the faculty at Notre Dame in 1965 when I came back.
Mm-hmm.
I had another extremely fortunate occasion. There was a guy by the name of Steve Piacek who had his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame about the same time I did, although I didn't know him. He was in physics. He was a brilliant guy, actually a Hungarian immigrant from the student revolution in the 50s. And
Okay.
he then went to MIT, got a PhD in physics, and got into ocean modeling. He came back to Notre Dame as a prof, for assistant prof for just a year, an academic year, and then went on with the Navy. But here he was, 1965, and the ink was still wet on the Fromm and Harlow article. And I had the pleasure to take a course in CFD. He didn't use the term CFD, it was numerical methods or something. But in the weather modeling and ocean modeling business, they were in fact using the Fromm and Harlow approach in sort of a baby stage. There were some calculations that were made with that new paradigm of just turning on the equations and letting them chug and see what happens. So I was really fortunate in that regard. So, got another
That's
question?
Yeah, that's amazing. So, as you were going through this, it's really amazing to hear just how small it was, right? And today we
Yeah.
talk about it's still a small world, but it's really amazing, especially um, hearing the opportunities, right? You've talked about this too, that the timing was very fortuitous. So let's talk about your book.
Okay.
What was the motivation? And did you realize that you were going to cement the name of CFD for everyone else? Like you've mentioned this, that people talked about CFD and they did numerical computations, but your book, in my mind, and every reference I can find, is the first time that it's definitively called as a subject and named computational fluid dynamics. So just really curious on the process of the book, and if you realized that as you were writing the book, that this was the name that was going to stick.
Actually, I did. I was pretty confident that the name would stick. Of course, the word computational or computation was not a new word. People knew what I meant by it, but it was clear to me that we needed a term to differentiate this new paradigm of numerical experiments from very good numerical work on things like boundary layer calculations, method characteristics, 2-point boundary value problems, for or Sommerfeld equations and boundary. A lot of really good mathematics and a lot of good numerical work, but it was different. And the difference, Fromm and Harlow didn't use the word computational either, but they used the word simulation. And simulation to me carries a lot of the same connotations as I was hoping that computational fluid dynamics does. But simulation is also applied to some pretty cheesy work. Cartoons. There's one school, maybe it's died off by now, but of people who were supposedly doing fluid dynamics with full Navier-Stokes equations, but they didn't have any partial differential equations. It was sort of a cartoon of you take your three neighboring points and divide them by two or something. And they got something that looked like a vortex. And people were talking about overselling. They were really overselling that. The fact is that the Reynolds number limitation, even for this qualitative resemblance, was about order of one. And I remember listening to a lecture one time, and I said, "What is the Reynolds number limitation?" And the guy said, "Yeah, well, there is a little limitation there." So, in terms of the motivation for writing the book, I'd say pretty much like everyone else. Uh, it was a new area. I loved it. It was very fluid dynamics itself is a very aesthetically appealing subject, right? Da Vinci, had figures of rapids forming and stuff like. Everybody is captivated by real flow dynamics, physical flow dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So I just had the urge to talk about it. And probably the other thing is that I had already a lot of writing experience. And I just like to write. I really enjoy it. I'd been the copy editor on the Notre Dame Technical Review, which was an award-winning magazine for a couple of years. I spent a summer at the Heath Company writing manuals for Heath kits, and I just enjoyed writing and still do. In fact, I can tell you that my wife and I co-authored a book, which you might still find on Amazon and a used copy, but we did that for our 60th birthdays. We went around the world on a cruise and with the semester at sea, and we wrote a book called At Sea at 60, Recollections from a round the world voyage. So yeah, I just enjoy writing. Well,
yeah.
I was probably less interested in the actual profits to be made from it. I'd have been happy if I broke even, which was questionable for a while, but it did finally catch on. And actually ended up doing quite well, and I hope yours works out as well. And the nicest thing was, of course, I self-published, and as you know, it was very rare in those days. The only one in fluid dynamics that I knew was a guy by the name of Horner, who was a German immigrant post-World War II. And he wrote a terrific book on fluid dynamic drag, aerodynamic drag, and self-published it himself. But it was nice after I got the book out and selling. After a couple of years, people started wanting to do translations, and that felt good. Legitimate publishing company in Japan did a translation of the book. I got a first-class flight in Japan Airlines to go give a seminar on it. The Russians wrote me a very stuffy letter. Russians were very difficult to deal with in those days. And it wasn't a question of, we would like to translate your book. The Russian letter said, Mere Publishing, we will translate your book. If you want, we will give you $1,000. Essentially, if you're not, the heck with it. So I said, okay, I'll take it. And the Chinese did a translation of it, and didn't even have the courtesy to let me know they did it. I didn't find out till 10 years later when an employee of mine from the old country gave me the Chinese version. But then it caught on internationally in English, did total of a little over 13,000 copies. And like 40% of those sales were overseas, most of them in Europe. And through the dust settle, probably I made about $100K out of it. And that was in 1975 to $85. So it was actually worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how many of our listeners understand publishing and the publishing industry. To sell that many copies is amazing. There are so many books that don't sell many copies at all. So that's just putting in context. People might think, oh, that's not a lot. That is a ton for a
Yeah.
technical book.
No, this is not purple prose, you know. Not everybody's going
Yeah.
to buy this thing. And actually, people
Yeah.
told me, European colleagues, like Aki Runcho, said that
Yeah.
there was a lot of piracy going on in Europe. There were kind of wholesale operations of people making Xerox copies of it and passing it
Mm.
out, even though I had right in the front of the book how to contact Hermosa publishers to get some. But
Yeah.
yeah, that worked out pretty nice. And my later books, the V&V books, for example, have not had that kind of publishing success. And I would say I'm a little more than broke even on it, but I didn't really make anything out of it. But I actually think those the V&V books of verification and validation are as much of a contribution. I'm really quite proud of that work. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's a little more universal. Um, as the next really good book in computational fluid dynamics was the one that Tannehill, can't think of his name. Tannehill,
Fletcher and
Butcher,
Anderson.
and Anderson, that's right.
Mhm.
And they didn't use the vorticity stream function approach. I don't think they mentioned it. They used the primitive variables, UVP, like the Los Alamos people did, which is much more
Mhm.
flexible. You know, stream function vorticity can be made to work in 3D, but it's pretty elegant and in the mathematics involved. And then they had some turbulence modeling in there, which I didn't have. So
Okay.
that was sort of the break point where I figured my book was really becoming obsolete by that time.
Yeah.
And
That's
I've
an
also,
amazing experience.
yeah, yeah, the sales, book publishing, as you probably have figured out already, it's a strange business in that it's a very high uh, initial uh, investment of money and especially time, but also just running hard copy books. You know, you can have a garage full of books with a lot of money. Now, once they get selling, if it really sells, it's trivial to run another few thousand and sell them. So the income stream actually gets very good straight away. I've also written a book on just a little booklet, A Defense of Computational Physics. And what it is, it's a critique of the Karl Popper's philosophy of falsificationism. Popper and Kuhn are generally regarded as the two most important philosophers of science in the first half of the 20th century. And
Mhm.
I'll just summarize it to say, well, one summary is that he was interested in truth. I mean, you know, truth, like ultimate truth. And all we're interested in is accuracy, you know. I mean, none of our turbulence models are true. They're not the Navier-Stokes equations, you know, but they can be
Yeah.
accurate, all of them in some. So he just said, you know, you were after truth and you could never guarantee it. And had some other goofy stuff that kind of stuff that gives academics a bad name. You know what I mean? So it's only
Well,
100
one of
pages
the things,
long, but I really enjoyed writing that more than the others, I think. If anybody wants to buy
yeah.
one, I suggest I'll just say, please read the end notes because there's a lot of good stuff that I enjoyed in the end notes.
Yeah, and it's only 99 cents on Amazon Kindle, right?
It's US dollars, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yep. Yeah. You had sent me a copy of that one, and I did read through it, and one of the things that I really appreciated that you pointed out, because I saw this just recently this week, the statement from, uh, George Box, EP Box, right? That his first statement was essentially, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And
Yeah.
I see this more that people leave off the qualifier, and this is something you point out in your text, that it's often used in a way to just justify. I feel like it's sometimes used in a way to justify sloppy work.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I love that you talk about in Charles Hirsch's textbook, Numerical Computation of Internal and External Flows, does a good job of this too, of just highlighting that it's an approximation. and the
Mhm.
fidelity of the approximation gets better and better as we use and incorporate different physics. And so I really, really liked your defense of computational physics. It was really a well-rounded argument for. Some people might think it's semantics, but I think you really brought it a really clear and really good point of the way we talk about things in the scientific community is important.
Yes. Yes, it is. And I remember when I really appreciate your comments on that defense of computational physics. And I didn't want to get into that kind of detail of Box, but I agree that, and I tell you, other people that I've worked with at the national laboratories, his statement in that paper has really caused people a lot of problems. Uh, and when it comes to verification and validation, there's a difference between the two. And I remember giving an AIAA paper, and the fellow after me was a really good guy and a friend of mine from Grumman. And he did terrific work, and he just dismissed it. He said, I don't want to get into this semantics thing. And I tell you, if you get a contract from the government or a consulting contract, and they say you're going to deliver a validated code, you darn well better know what they mean by validated. And it's not a question of checking the Fortran or even, doing convergence testing. It's a question of all of that plus comparing it to experiments. And they have to be good
Yeah.
experiments. So, yeah, you can't be casual about verification,
Yeah.
validation, confirmation. Oh, they're very
Yeah.
different, and they can be very important.
One anecdote from my side. I
Yeah.
was at a seminar in undergrad, and we had a company that was presenting on some work, and they told the story of it. This company, they did some work for some dam construction and rehabilitation. And the engineer was joking in earthen dams and other dams. He was joking with the client that all dams leak. It's not a problem. But using the word leak to a client and his understanding of it, he said, I learned very quickly words matter and we need to be articulate. And
Yeah.
you can make that joke with probably your friends that understand the how you mean it and in good humor.
Right.
But he said that was a fatal mistake to make it with the client, saying that, yeah,
Yeah.
your dam leaks. It's fine. All dams leak. So
Uh,
it just
well,
reminded me of that as you were talking about
a
that.
similar one, it's a problem that we are all burdened with, and it's um, we just inherited it. Was it when mathematicians started looking at numerical approximations of things? They naturally, being mathematicians, they use the word error, right? It's a lousy place to start. When you do a Taylor series expansion, and you're trying to determine the accuracy, okay, it's a second order error. And if you end up in really in hot water in court, for example, if you get sued because some, well, I'm just involved with some civil engineering structural stuff now. And if your thing fails, a bridge comes down, and then you start describing how you justify everything, and you start talking about errors. What do you think the lawyer is going to do? He's going to jump in. That's why I like to talk about numerical approximations. And that means, of course,
Yeah.
connotes something that, well, the more mesh points we have, the more accurate it is, limits and that. But, a lot of people on those juries haven't had a basic course in calculus, and they don't appreciate that stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
good
It's
point.
interesting is well, yeah, I've been working on my CFD book for some time, as you know, and I've shared with you, but one of the struggles has been to just put it as clear as possible because I really obviously I can't go too far. I'll never get it published, right?
Right.
But trying to get it as clear as possible. And I've joke I've used a preliminary working title as how close is close enough to understand this approximation idea, right? How close do we need to get for it to be valuable or useful in what we're doing for the purpose of why we're doing the analysis? But can you tell us more about your writing procedure and you talk about like what was the publishing process like? You told us why you wanted to do it, but what was the actual process like for you, right?
Yeah.
Did you did you know exactly what you wanted to put in, and how did you go about about doing the actual work of the writing.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I hope your other viewers are a little interested in it at least. Uh, I had done a really big dissertation. This is not, I'm not bragging. I'm just saying it was big. There were lots of, I don't
Yeah.
know, 400 or 500 pages. And friend Harry McDonald, who's later director at Ames, NASA Ames, he just as a colleague, he just said, you really did too much on your dissertation. Well, the reason I did it that much was because it was a new PhD program. Okay. So the people in the department they wanted to be sure that they wouldn't be criticized by letting this first guy go through. And I had the advantage of 3 years of teaching experience, so I was sort of the teaching community. But I wanted a lot of insurance, so I really went overboard in both the amount of work that I did and the background and everything. So it was a big dissertation. And my friend that I mentioned, my first office partner when I came to Notre Dame, Charlie Knapp, again, he's the guy. It was his idea. He said, we were lifelong friends. He says about 3 years after, well, let's see. He says, yeah, about 3 years after I got the PhD, he said, you ought to take that dissertation and make it into a book. And so that gave me the motivation. Then Knapp not only started me going on it, he went to his department head at University of Kentucky and got me a visiting professorship for the fall semester of 1970. So we pack up the kids, moved to Lexington, took a leave of absence from Sandia Laboratories, and taught a course in computational fluid dynamics. And the only thing I had to do for that semester was teach 3 hours a week on CFD from a book that I was working. No student life committees, no other distractions. It was by far the most productive 3 months of my life, and I'm sure would never be equaled. I can only wish you had the similar kind of a situation. So then,
Well, I've got.
yeah.
I was just going to say I've got 4 kids, so I
Oh,
understand the children aspect too
yes.
of that
Well,
as well. So yeah, I was wondering, how did you do it? Right?
we had 3 children by the time I was finished up the PhD. By the time we went to Lexington, we had 5. And yeah, the Naps even helped us find you. I think it was one of 2 rentals available in Lexington, and it happened to be right across the street from them. So we just had a terrific support system. The people in Lexington were just so nice to us. And my wife remembers it rained a lot, but it was really a very good time. And it's, as I say, especially really productive at the time.
Yeah.
And then I had it finished. So I had sent out book proposals to legitimate publishers, all the ones, Wiley, Millen, everyone you ever heard of, 32 proposals, 32 rejections. And
Wow.
and I took solace when I heard that the original MASH TV program, the proposal for that had 32 rejections, and I think it's still running. So anyhow, I got the book ready. Understand this is not a file. You don't send a file off because they didn't do it. You had camera ready copy. And the figures were done and pasted up for camera ready. There's no PDF files with graphics or anything like that. So
Yeah.
a friend had put me in touch with a small-time publisher. So I get the book all ready to go, and I call him, and the phone's disconnected. I find out he's out of business already. So I have this book with a lot of sweat and tears in it, and a lot of money tied up with a growing family. And then somebody, I think it was Macmillan, showed an interest and said, why don't you give us a more formal proposal and we'll have it reviewed. I said, no, I got to get this thing done. So I had a small publishing company just on paper set up. And I knew about copyright laws and things like that because my wife had written
Yeah.
a children's booklet with and
Okay.
illustrated. So we knew the ropes on that kind of stuff, and getting ISBN numbers. Uh, Hope you know about that. And so we went through that, just put the money in, did the legwork, and uh, and got it published. Again, I just have to cry on everybody's shoulder. Sorry, but just remember there were no word processors in those days.
Yeah. I can't even fathom that. Like everything is just default PDF attachment or a large file transfer. So yeah. So I imagine that was a nice feedback loop too, though, in your writing and then lecturing and then editing and writing. Was that the case that
Yeah,
you'd go lecture from the material, feedback, and maybe work it a second time? And
yeah, exactly. It was very satisfying. The only thing that did happen was the writing of the book, where I was in writing the book and where I was in the lecture, got a little out of sync. Because
yeah,
by the time I was doing some of the more sort of higher level stuff, uh, the class was still back at the lower level, but
yeah,
but it still remained. It was just a terrific experience. I can't think of a better way to do it than
yeah.
getting an appointment like that.
It sounds idyllic for sure. So, switching gears here to more the market and tracking things over time, did you sense the market became more competitive, like the CFD market, and did you sense a change in the way CFD was being done in the atmosphere?
Yeah, yeah, very much so. It was, it's a little sad. Things just got a little more competitive. Uh, there were a lot more people, so it was didn't. It's one thing like if you go to elementary school with somebody, that's a different relationship than you have 20 years later with somebody new that you meet. So yeah, it was. I won't say I don't want to make it sound terrible. It wasn't dog eat dog or anything like that, but it just
No.
didn't have that spontaneity and freshness and uh, friendliness, uh, and it's just a little less open. Uh, you know, in the very early days, if I got something to work, I was calling my friends and telling them how I did it, and bragging about it, and they
Mhm.
were glad to hear
Yeah.
about it and vice versa. But it just got more competitive, and there were some, oh, if it's fraudulent is there was some question of who did what first. In the old days,
Mm.
people were happy to quote just from a casual conversation. You just see, and I've done it myself, just reference somebody, personal communications on this was
Communication.
his idea. In fact, I should tell you about what happened with my PhD study in that regard. Uh, but anyhow, that attitude and friendly, almost amateurish environment, yeah, had to give way, but it's natural. Uh,
Yeah.
can I tell you about?
Well, definitely.
Can I tell
Yeah.
you about
Please.
John
Please.
Allen? This is
Yes.
this goes back to the small world theme of the early days of CFD. So it's 1967. I'm still working on my PhD. I'm taking a uh, interview trip. It was either to Sandia Labs or Texas A&M. I forget which. So I get on this the old Boeing 707, and there are three seats across, and I'm in the aisle seat. There was a young guy in Air Force uniform between in the middle, and another guy about my age sitting next to the window. So everybody says, hello, excuse me, bump, and everybody sits down and starts reading their stuff. We're all in our mid to late 20s. So I'm reading along, and I look over towards the window, and I see this drawing my dissertation problem, the supersonic flow over a backstep. And I mean, people didn't even know what CFD was. In fact, I wasn't using the word myself. And I looked at it,
Yeah.
what the heck is going on? It turned out his name was John Allen, and he was a PhD candidate at Princeton. He was working under S.I. Ching, who's an old time, very well known viscous flow guy, viscous shear layers and that kind of stuff. And he's doing the
Okay.
same kind of work I am, knew about Fromm and Harlow and everything, time dependent. And so, needless to say, we started talking. And he was way ahead of me. He wasn't doing any of the subsonic work. He was doing supersonic work and was way ahead of me. He had much better definitions. But it was my problem, the lip shock, the recompression shock, and particularly at the upper boundary, there's a shock wave that forms, from the flow recompressing when it gets back towards the center line or the boundary symmetry line. So you get a shock wave going up to the upper wall of your computational grid. So you're going to get all kinds of reflections and junk. This is just true CFD junk up there. And boy, his looked great. And I said, "How did you get that to work?" And he told me he tried extrapolating like I did for outflow boundaries very successfully. We were doing the same kind of approaches. And he had tried algebraic extrapolations, very arbitrary at the upper wall. And then I think it was actually S.I. Cheng, his advisor, that suggested that what he do is the primal Meyer. Probably you don't, in civil engineering, you might not do supersonic flow that much, but
No.
shock wave, a particular closed form shock wave expansion fan, I should say, primal Meyer expansion. Anyhow, it's a closed form solution, and you can use that. It's a simple wave sort of extrapolation, but it's not just along grid lines, it's along characteristic lines. And
Okay.
boy, did it work beautifully. And I cited him, in my dissertation in the beginning and my
Yeah.
credits, and just went over backwards, including in the journal article, which was only on the the journal article was only subsonic. But the funny thing was, so we're sitting here all this time, and finally, John and I come up for air, so to speak, and stop. And this young Air Force guy, sitting between us, looks up and he says, "Right over here," where I can't find. He said, and he points to the sharp corner. He said, "What was your numerical boundary condition? How did you handle that at the sharp corner?" I mean, we were flabbergasted. I really don't think there was another PhD candidate in the country, probably in the world, working on that problem. There was never another one that I know of, and I covered the literature
Yeah.
that was ever published on that. And here the two of us are on the same airplane, one seat away with another guy who seems to know what was going on. It was just incredible coincidence.
So
The story made rounds in the CFD community at that point.
yeah, that's amazing. So I'm curious to know if did he pick up enough on your conversation that he just asked the question, or did he really know what was going on? And the Air Force guy,
I
do you
don't know.
think
We
he
didn't pursue it. I guess we were
Okay.
coming into the approach or something, and we didn't
Yeah.
know what to say. But I forget what happened after that. So I'm kind of blocking
Yeah. Well,
out what
that's
we.
amazing. Yeah, what are the chances of that, right? This concludes part 1 of the interview with Patrick Roache. Part 2 will be released next week as episode 19. Thank you for listening. Really, thank you. Did something about this episode stand out to you? If so, please go ahead and share it with others on LinkedIn or other social media so they can find this as well. See you next time.